Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, April 6th, 2022. And on this episode, I've got a story about a big city East Coast police department that should be shocking, but isn't, because I think it represents the norm rather than the exception to the rule. We're talking about stolen funds through civil asset forfeiture, warrantless mass surveillance through Stingrays or cell site simulators, partnering with the feds with equitable sharing and non-disclosure agreements, and off-the-books secret spending. But first of all, I really want to thank you for spending some of your time with me today. I really appreciate you being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. And while we wait another minute or so for people to get notifications to join us in the live stream, a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. Thanks for being here. Tim Martin in South Central Arizona, Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Sharon Patriots says, be encouraged, Patriots. Leah Tanya King in Stone County. I apologize if I got your name wrong, but thank you for being here. Clay Kent, Erwin Haverneck in Omaha. Smash that like button. Lisa Believe, Murray Ray in Michigan, Tyler B, Alan Mosley, and everyone else. Thank you all for spending some of your time with me today. But let's get right to this. I want to talk about, and there's hi to Jay Armstrong in Alaska. Thanks, Jay. I always appreciate your feedback and your comments over on Facebook. Let's take a look at this. First, we're going to talk about Stingray surveillance, cell site simulators, a quick overview of that, and I've got another episode if you want more details. Then we're going to talk about civil asset forfeiture and the same, and then we're going to get into this big city police department on the East Coast and how they're kind of tying it all together with the feds to rip us off, to spy on us. It's really, really nasty stuff. And let's start out with the Electronic Frontier Foundation to talk about IMSI catchers or cell site simulators. We call them Stingray. Stingrays is a brand name for a company, Harris Corporation, the brand of their cell site simulator that they were selling. I don't think they actually sell it anymore, but there's other companies that do this. Cell site simulators, also known as Stingrays or IMSI catchers, are devices that masquerade, keep in mind, they masquerade as legitimate cell phone towers. They're spoofing cell phone towers. They trick phones within a certain radius into connecting to the device rather than a tower. So, they connect to all of it. So if you're sending a text, doing some internet research, looking something up, looking at an SMS message, whatever it may be, making a phone call, you send through your phone, along with its IMSI number, you're sending that data to a tower, and that tower connects to other data centers and things like that and transmits the data around. But when you use one of these cell site simulators, it first connects to the spoofed device, the Stingray, and then seamlessly passes things along. You're not going to hear any clicking like you saw in old 1960s movies. You're not going to know that this is happening. It's totally seamless, happens in milliseconds, and while that happens, they can collect all kinds of data and information on you. Here's how they put it. Cell site simulators operate by conducting a general search of all cell phones within the device's radius in violation of basic constitutional protections. A general search. Remember, part of the American Revolution, one of the biggest complaints was about general warrants. Instead of particularly describing the person, place, or thing to be searched or seized, general warrants. And that's what these cell site simulators do. EFF goes further. They say once your cellular device, once your phone, maybe this is older. Anyways, once your phone has connected to a cell site simulator, it can determine your location and read identifying data such as your IMSI or ESN numbers directly from your phone. It can also intercept metadata. And I know a lot of people want us to think that collecting metadata is just innocuous. No one can figure out nothing from anybody, but the algorithms are pretty smart. Such as information about calls made, the amount of time on each call, the content of unencrypted phone calls and text messages, which should encourage us to use encrypted services, and some types of data usage, such as websites visited. It's not total in what it collects, but it's pretty significant. Additionally, they say, marketing materials produced by the manufacturers of cell site simulators indicate that they can be configured to, check this out, divert calls and text messages, edit messages, and even spoof the identity of a caller in text messages and calls. So they can fake text messages to people. Law enforcement, well, we can't prove it in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt, but I'm pretty confident this type of stuff happens. And they're using this mass warrantless process all the time. Now, they've been using these for decades, but here from the ACLU, they say until a few years ago, even the existence of this technology was shrouded in near complete secrecy. All surveillance stuff, they say it's national security, so you can't know about this. It's as if it's bad for you to know how your government is supposed to be running. And if you've ever heard jokes about the NSA, they used to call it no such agency, as if it didn't even exist. So they had to pretend it didn't exist for decades. The same type of thing happened with these cell site simulators, which are generally used by local law enforcement. We know that people have used them in overseas conflicts. We've in war theater. We've seen federal agents use them. But as a day-to-day use, it's generally local law enforcement using it under the purview of the feds, and then under permission of the feds, and signing non-disclosure agreements with the feds, and then passing the data along collected to the feds. So local law enforcement, like usual, is acting like a federal agency. As it turns out, they write, the FBI went to great lengths to prevent knowledge of cell site simulators from entering public awareness, requiring state and local law enforcement agencies to sign non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, before purchasing the technology. A practice it now refuses to confirm or deny it has continued. So we don't know as of December 2021 if they're even doing this anymore, but we do have some documents that show that it's been done in the past. These agreements not only prevented cops from revealing their purchase or use of the technology to the public, but it even forced them to hide it from judges and defense attorneys in court proceedings. And short, basically, if through discovery, someone figured out that maybe they were using a cell site simulator, there were many times they would just rather lose the case than establish the precedent that they have to have some sunshine on their activities. If you want to learn more about this, cell site simulators and other stuff that they use on a local level to conduct surveillance on a national level, Willie, I did an episode a couple years ago, street level surveillance, top 4 technologies, and how to stop them, primarily covering the work over at Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF.org. Now, with that, a brief overview of civil asset forfeiture. This is legalized government robbery. Sometimes it's armed, sometimes it's not. Usually it's some kind of armed robbery. Civil forfeiture allows police to seize property on the mere suspicion that it is involved in criminal activity. This is part of criminal activity. We don't have to prove it. We're going to take it. Now you have to prove that it wasn't. Flipping due process on its head. Prosecutors from Institute for Justice, IJ.org, prosecutors can then forfeit or permanently keep the property without ever charging its owner with a crime. Here in our annual State of the Nullification Movement report over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, we describe it this way. This is page 79. How is asset forfeiture lucrative? In many states, law enforcement agencies get to keep some or all the proceeds from forfeiture. This creates a perverse policing for profit motive. Forfeiture proceeds often supplement or increase department budgets, or they're off books, as we're going to find out in a little bit, and even serve as an indispensable funding source. As a result, law enforcement agencies become incentivized to seize as much property as possible. And then when we're talking about the federal program, even when states and the state-level civil asset forfeiture program, the feds, if you watched or listened to my episode just on March 9th, criminal, the Federal Equitable Sharing Asset Forfeiture Program, which Uncle Joe helped create in call years 1984 and has been around for decades. So left and right together have thrown this upon us, thrust us upon this situation where the feds use this equitable sharing program as an end run around restrictions on civil asset forfeiture, blocking civil asset forfeiture on the state level. I do encourage you to learn more about that. I'm not going to talk about it in detail. Short version, if the states say you can't do civil asset forfeiture, you can't rob people like this, the feds will come in and say, well, just tell us it's a federal case and we'll do the robbing and you'll get most of the money. It's 80% in most situations. So I will link to that as well. And that brings me to Boston, and talking about linking in the show notes. I should mention at this point that if you want to find the stuff that I'm mentioning, I keep saying, oh, it'll be in the show notes. Check out this article, or I'm referencing this episode. They will all be included in the blog post that I publish for this individual episode. You can find them all over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. You can find all the latest episodes. You can find various different categories that we're on. You can find all the different platforms that we're on, both video, audio only podcast edition, live streaming, archive video versions, etc., and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now let's talk about Boston, that big city East Coast Police Department that's basically a great example of how all of these things come together. Feds robbing people, mass warrantless surveillance, and off-books secret spending. Well, let's go back to April of 2021. WBUR was doing an investigation to how civil asset forfeiture proceeds were being spent. And so they requested, this is from ProPublica, this will be linked to in the show notes so you can read it. There's some pictures of documents and the like, really interesting reporting here. They requested from Boston police all invoices for purchases made with civil asset forfeiture money between 2017 and 2019. One transaction, they said, stood out. I'm sure there were many others, but one they really focused on for this report. $627,000. $627,000 paid to a company, not Harris Corporation, but another company that makes cell site simulators, not a Stingray branded one, but paid to Tactical Support Equipment. But it was identified in the invoice. They're even obfuscating in the invoice, not calling it a cell site simulator, but they're calling it a multi-channel, multi-band base station. $627,000 that they're spending on this. WBUR, they report, obtained model numbers from invoices to establish that this equipment was a Stingray. A cell site simulator would be more correct to actually point that out. Now, Mike Meharry, in a blog that we published at the beginning of this week, he pointed out that the Boston City Council, you'd think, well, why are they spending asset forfeiture funds on this? Doesn't this just go to a general fund? And then they still have to have what they spend their money on budgeted? Well, Boston City Council, typically what they say, scrutinize proposed spending by the police department. But because it bought the Stingray using forfeiture funds, the Boston Police Department was, quote, able to circumvent the council. So there is no governing body that can actually even know what the cops are spending stuff on. And on top of it, let's say Massachusetts finally ended civil asset forfeiture. That would have done nothing in this situation, not just because every time we see this happen where they only ended on a state level or a state and local level and don't address the federal level, then they just turn everything into a federal case. We've seen this a lot in Missouri and California and elsewhere. It doesn't matter if it's a red state or a blue state. This is just how it plays out. But in this situation, it wouldn't have mattered because they just, even if they ended it on a state level, because it was still purchased with federal forfeiture funds, equitable sharing. So they weren't even doing a state forfeiture. They were acting as federal agents, partnering probably with the DEA and or the ATF. These are the top two ones under the FBI and the DOJ that they do these forfeiture programs. They do investigations for the federal government. Well, the feds are involved in so many things that they can't even handle the stuff that they're supposed to do. So they're relying on states and localities to do all their enforcement work for them. And this is creating a nationalized police state. Here from ProPublica, the only city review of the purchase, which was made with federal forfeiture funds. This is the only mention that they say of this being a federal program. Came from the procurement department confirming that the funds were available. Now, I'm certain that ProPublica, the people there are probably on side of the current administration, would defend it all the time. So maybe that's why they don't talk about how this is a federal forfeiture program that came heavily. Now, he wasn't the only guy, but it was a bipartisan thing. Him and Reagan and other people gave us this federal forfeiture program. They don't really focus on that. But to me, if you follow the money, that centralization of power is a serious problem. Mike Meharry points out that this is not the only time they've taken this approach, at least that we're aware of. He said this is the second cell site simulator purchased by the Boston Police Department that we know of. It bought its first Stingray that we know of. I'm just adding that on the side in 2013. According to ProPublica, he writes, the department used budgeted money for the first Stingray, but information on its use has been mostly redacted. So the city actually did budget it. So I guess As soon as you open the door and say, well, we're okay with you doing this, maybe you shouldn't be surprised that they're doing it off books later on when you don't give them enough budget. And this is an example of how this whole concept of defund the police has really just been a sham all along. They're not really defunding. And I know a lot of people don't want to see them defunded, but organizations that are spending all their time ripping people off and spying on people and doing warrantless surveillance and gun control and prohibition, all this stuff, they're enforcing all kinds of stuff that shouldn't exist. They don't need the budgets that they have, so they actually should have significantly reduced budgets if we're focusing on the Constitution. Well, anyways, this first one that the supposed first one that they got in 2013, that time they paid $400,000 for it. And I think it went right to Harris Corporation. And that either tells us, well, inflation is, the printing of money, inflation is an increase in the money supply, has caused these things to go from 400 grand to 627. Otherwise, maybe someone else is making a little bit more money. Anyways, here we can actually see on the screen, I've got an image or a PDF of the non-disclosure agreement that the FBI required local law enforcement, at least in 2013, to sign before they could actually get this thing from Harris Corp. And here, I'm just going to read this section so you can understand what they're doing. In the event that the Boston Police Department receives a request pursuant to the Freedom of Information Act or an equivalent state or local law, the civil or criminal discovery process or other judicial, legislative, or administrative process to disclose information concerning the Harris Corporation wireless collection equipment or technology, its associated software, operating manuals, and any related documentation, including technical, engineering, description, and capabilities, the Boston Police Department will immediately notify the FBI of any such request telephonically, and in writing in order to allow sufficient time for the FBI to seek to prevent disclosure through appropriate channels. Short version, if anybody uses the court system, they use Freedom of Information Act requests, open records requests, anything. Don't respond to it. Ignore it. First, tell the FBI. We've given you the contact of who you're reaching out to in Quantico, the unit chief of the tracking technology unit, operational technology division, etc. You're supposed to contact two people. They give you a direct phone number. You're supposed to call them and say, hey, someone, we've got a case here, and we've been using this warrantless surveillance. It might get thrown out, blah, blah, blah. What do we do? Well, keep your mouth shut. The FBI is going to figure this out, and we're going to do whatever we can to shut them up. And that's really how it plays out basically everywhere all the time. And they didn't even, Meharry reports that there was a hearing on the matter in the Boston City Council. I think once this got out, some people in the general public were pretty pissed. Maybe some of the city councilors, I would think they're mostly all bad, but sometimes you get in these very left-leaning cities really bad on spending and government control in one area, but really good on surveillance issues in another area, and vice versa. So sometimes. And I think there are some city councilors in Boston that were actually upset about this, and maybe there's only one or two that were able to get this hearing, but they had a public hearing about this. And here Mike reports that Bureau Chief for Investigative Services, Felipe Colon, said the department has deployed a cell site simulator 106 times over the last 6 years. 106 times. 36 of those deployments were without a warrant, admittedly by them. Admittedly, they used it at least 36 times without a warrant. But at the end of the day, I would argue that since a Stingray, a cell site simulator, is used for blanket surveillance in a large city, maybe if you're looking for one person, whether you're getting a warrant or not, you're actually conducting surveillance on a bunch of people. It can never, maybe 1,000, maybe 10,000, maybe 50, maybe 5. You don't actually know. It can never be used under the standard of a warrant based on probable cause, particularly describing the place to be searched or the persons or things to be seized. It has to be blanket mass surveillance. So it can't actually, even if they get a judge to sign off on this, this is still mass warrantless surveillance, no matter what they want to call it, no matter how many times they admit that, well, sometimes we got a judge to approve this. And on top of this, civil asset forfeiture is theft. It's armed robbery. So they're partnering with the federal equitable sharing program that shouldn't exist either. So they're doing theft. They're working with the empire, partnering with the empire to steal, using that stolen money to buy gear off books secretly as possible to spy on everyone without a warrant. And again, they're doing their best to keep it a secret. And that brings me, just to close it out here, I want to bring it over to Patrick Henry, which I think has great insights here. He says, the liberties of a people never were, nor ever will be. Let's say that again. The liberties of a people never were, nor ever will be secure when the transactions of their rulers may be concealed from them. And this certainly was a bunch of different transactions that they've been working hard to conceal from the people. So there is no security for people's liberty. This is just security for the establishment, for the police state. And like I was saying at the beginning, I think this is kind of the standard approach. We could look to basically any major city, probably a lot of the smaller and mid-sized cities as well, and they also have this type of equipment. And as soon as they have this type of equipment, they act as federal agents. They love doing federal drug control, federal drug prohibition, federal gun prohibition. This civil asset forfeiture is generally gun and drug prohibition, stuff that shouldn't exist in the first place. I'm going to take a quick look over in the live chat and see if there's any questions that I can answer. There's a lot of comments. I really appreciate you guys doing that. Leaving comments really helps out trigger the algorithm and tells these platforms, primarily the mainstream video platforms, to show us to more people. It helps out a great deal. So does smashing the like, sharing links, or reviews on Apple Podcasts and the like. Clay Kent says, even encrypted data can no doubt be unencrypted by the NSA. I would say absolutely. In many situations, they can break into a lot of that. I don't have verification on what percentage. Of course, they're working on encryption breaking all the time, but the FBI certainly sees encryption as a problem because they're always leaning on these technology companies to give them a back door so they don't have to go through the process. And maybe they can get through, but they want to be able to get to everybody. They don't want all groups of people. They don't want average people to use encrypted transmissions, communication, because then they have to go through a special process to break it. They just want to be able to collect everyone's information, the location, etc. Here, Sharon Patriot says, turn location off on your phone unless you absolutely need it for directions. Now, that can help a little bit, but to be honest with you, even if you have your phone powered off, it's still transmitting the location. So they're still able to sweep this phone up. It is still connecting to that tower. It doesn't matter even if it's powered off. That's why people take the battery out. And my phone, for example, and I'm sure yours as well, so many of our phones, you have unremovable batteries as well. Walt Boyer, good to see you in Newberry, Florida. Leotonia King says, we have to create bills to prevent this in Missouri. We've actually seen some legislation on this in previous years to ban the use of warrantless cell site simulators. They, for some reason, have not gone forward. We have not been able to generate enough grassroots support, but in Missouri and everywhere. Checking out Jay Armstrong. Like I was saying at the beginning, love your comments, man. We have the right to be left alone from government intrusion. Certainly we do. That is a natural right like a man's house is his castle, right? That's that whole old school saying that now we can say a person's house is their castle, right? But of course, government doesn't want to follow the rules, and we have to be able to take a stand, resist the first approaches of tyranny, as Mercy Otis Warren told us, rather than let it keep rolling. Haji, Uncle Joe, Shades of Stalin. Certainly, the surveillance, the drug war, the robbery through the civil asset forfeiture, the foreign policy, all of that. The current White House resident has a rotten legacy from his many years of disservice in the Senate. Don't comply, nullify. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. Hope it was educational. If you support what we're doing, please do consider a membership over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We're working really hard to get this kind of information out there to as many people as possible, educating people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend both when government refuses to do so, which is every second of every single day. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Don't forget to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, smash the like button, and all that other stuff. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.